Hi, everybody. This is Professor Erica Vogel, and this lecture is Language Ideology, Media, and Ethnicity. And as you can see from the first picture, which is Belle and the Beast from Beauty and the Beast, we're going to talk about full-length animated films. And the article that we are reading is about Disney films. So we will introduce the concept of language ideology, which is ideas about language or what we think about the people who speak different languages. And we'll discuss the article Teaching Children to Discriminate, and then we'll talk about your film analysis that you're going to do. So linguistic anthropologists, which are one of the four fields of anthropology, they study languages and what we believe about people who speak languages, and they say that there are a few language myths or things that we believe to be true about languages which are not true. One of those is that some varieties of a language are not as good as others. So just thinking about English, for example, can you think about which varieties are thought of as being the worst or the farthest from the standard? So you don't have to say, but just think about that. Well, Dennis Preston, who's a linguistic anthropologist from a university in Michigan, he asked students to map out where they thought there were dialects of English and then to rate them on their accuracy on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the best. So he gave them a map like this. This is a map of the US with just the states on there. And then you should think about which is the best, 10, and which is the worst, 1. So why don't you look at this map or just think about what the map of the US looks like, and where could you imagine that the best and the worst dialects of English are spoken? So I'll just give you a second to look. So think about California and West Coast. How do you think those would rank? The South, the Midwest, like Chicago, the East Coast, like New York and New Jersey, Washington, D.C. Well, when he asked students in Michigan, they ranked themselves as being the best English speakers. So you can see that state with the darkest color, so dark states have the highest ratings, and then the lightest ones have the worst. So they rated themselves as the best English speakers. And then they gave New York City kind of a low rating, like a 4. And they also gave the South a 4, and from a 2 to a 4. And then they gave Washington, D.C. fairly high, just under themselves. Okay. When he asked students from Indiana, they gave themselves a little bit lower than the students from Michigan, a 6, but then they also ranked New York City low and Washington, D.C. high, and they also ranked the South low. Then, interestingly, when he asked people from the South, they also ranked the South as being low. If you look here, and then they ranked Washington, D.C. as being high and New York City as being low. And then they didn't have, they said Florida was pretty good, and looks like Colorado did well. Okay, so what the results showed were similarities, which was that everyone rated the South and New York City, New Jersey area as having the worst dialect, or what people think of as being farthest from the standard. And Southerners rated themselves low as well, because what they have is what Preston would argue is something called linguistic insecurity. Linguistic insecurity is when the speaker knows that the way that they speak is being judged by other people. So they know that other people think that the way they speak is wrong or bad, and so when they speak, they do so kind of like in knowing that they're being evaluated, and they could result in some insecurity. And then they gave the highest rating to Washington, D.C. So why do you think that is? Well, he found that it was because Washington, D.C. is the capital of the U.S., so it had some kind of level of authenticity that people thought that real English was going to come from there because that's the capital. And then respondents from Michigan rated themselves the highest, and this is what he calls linguistic security. Linguistic security is when people believe that they don't speak a dialect at all. They just say, oh, I just speak regular English. Other people have a dialect or an accent. But actually, every human who speaks a human language speaks a dialect, because a dialect just consists of the words we use and how we use them. It's not slang, but it's the tone, sounds, word choice that we use. And it's the particular form of a language that is peculiar to a specific region or social group. So everybody in the world speaks a dialect, but some seem more correct to us or worse to us. Why do you think that is? Well, if you think about the Washington, D.C. one, it's like we associate Washington, D.C. with something official, so maybe we also associate that kind of way they speak with official language. And the same goes for um, dialects that are kind of stigmatized or have a negative connotation in the media. So if you look here on this slide, I have pictures on the right of Cletus, who is a character from The Simpsons, who's supposed to be like a country bumpkin kind of rural guy. He's carrying a pig there. And then also a picture of the Beverly Hillbillies. So the South is one of these socially marked dialects of English. That's what Lippy Green would call them. Socially marked dialects are where if somebody speaks with that accent, then connotations immediately come to mind of stereotypes having to do with that type of way of speaking. So she argued, Preston argues that stereotypes about people get associated with the language features assigned to that resident. So we think, the stereotypes are that people from the South might be slow or rural or a little backward, a little simple. And that's the same stereotypes we have about the way they speak, that they speak slowly, with a twang, with kind of rural slang, right? And then on the left here, I have pictures from shows like The Real Housewives of New Jersey or The Jersey Shore. And those characters, and these ones kind of feed into the stereotypes, but of maybe pushy or crazy or wild or big and maybe violent, these shows. And then those are the same stereotypes that are associated with the ways that like New Yorkers speak, which is loud and fast and pushy and not letting other people interject. So you can see then the connections between these two. So when people make fun of somebody's accent, and this goes for language, when people are very angry that they're like, you should speak English, and they get really mad about that, it's not really about language, it's about the stereotypes that they have about people. So they use language as sort of an obvious or salient feature that they can like put their finger on, like I don't like that person because of the language they speak or the accent they have, but actually they're saying I don't like that person because of who they are, right? So there is something called an unmarked dialect, which is something that is spoken by people in a higher status group. And this would be a dialect like the Michigan one where they say like, oh, I don't have an accent. I just speak regular English. That would be an unmarked dialect. So if you call up, let's say you want to do a job interview and you talk to the job interviewer and they can't figure out where you're from, you just sound like, a regular, like middle class American or something, then that would be that you are speaking Muse, which is mainstream US English. And it's hard for them to say if you're from the South or from, Pittsburgh or New Jersey or something, or Boston, a place that has particular accent that's linked to that place and it has stereotypes about the place. And he argues that higher status groups always impose their behaviors on others, and then they claim those are the standard ones, and that includes the language that they speak. So what does Lippy Green want to find out with language use, characterization, and Disney films? This is from her article. Well, I have pictures here from different Disney films like Aladdin, there's the Avengers, The Lion King, Cinderella. Think about what does she argue and how does she research it for this article? Well, she is pretty much trying to figure out if there are systematic linkages between the types of characters that are featured in Disney films and then the types of accents that those characters always use. And then if having those kind of systematic linkages between certain characters and certain accents can teach children to discriminate against people who don't have that mainstream US English accent. Okay, so we talked about earlier, like Jasmine and Aladdin in the movie Aladdin, they speak with a Muse accent, which is that mainstream US English. They sound like just an American girl from California or from Michigan. But the bad guys speak with kind of like a fake Middle Eastern accent, right? So the farther away you get from the main characters, the more of an accent, the more pronounced accent they have. And this can teach children that what? Basically, either people with an accent are bad or at the least different or odd or have fewer kind of possibilities or choices in their lives than people that speak with a Muse accent. So some of her points or questions are, what impact did the use of accents or dialects to build character have on the child viewer, which is what I just was talking about. She also argues that children learn to identify and form stereotypes about the other. This is the other with a big O. So they learn that there are some people who are normal and some people who are weird or other. And the normal ones are like those characters that speak with the Muse, and others are the ones that have a stigmatized or different accent, like a Southern accent or a French accent. And then, yeah, she argues that films teach children to associate certain lifestyles with certain groups, and that's on page 85. So, like we talked about on the introduction to the class, that Chihuahuas always have like a Latino or Chicano accent, and then the Chihuahua character is usually causing trouble or doing something funny. They're not usually the main character or the hero. So you teaching children to associate certain lifestyles with certain groups. So here are her methods of Rosina Lippi Green. She watched every full-length animated Disney film made between 1938 and 1994 when the article was published. You can imagine how long that took. She had to watch each of them many times. It was 24 films and 371 characters total, and she looked at language variety and characterization. Including like the coloring of the characters. And on the bottom left here, you can see the three hyenas from The Lion King, and she looked at if they were darker than other characters or lighter, the ways that they behaved, their purpose in the film, and the kinds of words that they used, and then if they changed over the course of the film. So she looked at this is the evil stepmother queen from, oh my gosh, Sleeping Beauty, I think. Sorry. And she found that, for one thing, female characters hardly ever changed at all. And if they did, they changed no, they don't change. So female characters don't change. And males sometimes changed, but they only changed from bad to good. But this character, she's a female evil character. Not very many of those, but she doesn't change at all. She just stays evil. Also, what do bad guys sound like, she asked. Well, 20% of the Muse, that is mainstream US English speakers, are bad. So out of 100% of those, all the characters that speak Muse, only 20% are bad. But out of all the characters that are supposed to be non-native English speakers, so have like a foreign accent, 40% are bad. And she asked, why do filmmakers do this in terms of characterization? Like, why would they do that? Make more bad characters, higher proportion of bad characters speak with an accent than good characters. Well, she argues that this is something that's been going on since, the beginning of theater, that the filmmakers and playwrights use that technique as a way to immediately create character because they don't have a long time in order to tell you about this person. So if they speak with an accent, then you immediately take on like the stereotypes or the kind of characterization that is associated with that accent. So Disney did not invent this. However, they use it and they use the same accents over and over again, and they have a great deal of access to children. So millions and millions of children watch almost sometimes exclusively Disney films. So they've got kind of a dominating presence in the lives of children about the kind of media images that they see. And a child could interpret that this is how the world works, right? Because if you're only watching Disney films or a lot of animated films or TV shows and people with southern accents are always doing funny things or silly things or they're always rural, like think about the truck Mater from Cars, right? They're always that kind of character, then what is that child going to understand about Southern people or the people with a Southern accent? They're going to have a stereotype formed before they even meet them. She also asked who could be human or who can just dream of being human. So she found that out of 161 Muse characters, 43% were humanoids, 54% were animal, and 2.5% were inanimate creatures like a teapot. Okay, so 54% animal and 43% human. But of AAV speakers, and AAVE is African American Vernacular English, that is a rule-based dialect, right? That many actors use the dialect, like Eddie Murphy uses it, but he switches back and forth. And Chris Rock, they both switch back and forth between Muse and AAVE. But AAVE speakers and Southern accents were 100% animal. So those are pretty striking statistics when you think about it, that a child could learn from that what? What do you guys think? Well, Libby Green would argue that a child could learn that characters that speak with that AAVE accent can only be animals or can only be, do limited things in life. So they could associate that accent with limited life choices or less than human. Okay, so it's a very dangerous message she's arguing. Other common themes. What are the common themes in Disney films? Like, what are the common themes in the movies? One is good and evil. There's happy endings. That's like a common thing that always happens. Parents get killed. That's a weird common theme in Disney films. Even in films that are not animated but are Disney-like, there's this one called Chimpanzee that I show in my bioanthropology class. They follow a family of chimpanzees in the forest, and even in that, there's a whole story sequence where the mom gets killed and the baby's left alone. The damsel in distress motif, where the woman has to be saved, like in Tarzan or in other films. And character development, like I mentioned before, only males get to develop, and then they only change from being bad to good. Nobody goes from good to bad. And then female characters don't get to change at all. So if you think of I have a little box here. What are the tropes of Disney and accents? So if you have the characters that are like aristocrats or rich people, what accent do they usually have? And what kind of characters do they play? Or if you have hot-tempered or sexy rascals or chefs, what accent do they usually have and what kind of characters do they play? What about males that speak that Muse accent, which is the mainstream US English, or Muse females? So why don't you take a second and just kind of think about this, fill out this table in your notes. Okay, Okay. And then also think about what kind of message does this send to children. Well, often the aristocrats or rich people, no matter where they're from, they are played by someone with a British accent because that is a prestige form in the US. That British accent is the one that in America we think is prestigious. So you'll see like officers, like even in Star Wars, the officers will speak with a British accent while the regular soldiers speak with an American accent or muse. Okay, if they're hot-tempered, sexy rascal chefs, they often have a French accent. And there's 38 characters in Beauty and the Beast, and 5 have French accents. And a lot of them are involved in food preparation or flirting. So to be truly French, you need to do one of those things, to be a flirt or to do food prep. You can think of all the many chefs in animated films that are French, like Ratatouille. He's not, but that's a French-based film about chefs. There's the Les Poissons guy, chef from Little Mermaid. Okay, and then if you're muse male, you can be human, villain, animal, attractive, unattractive, rescue people, be the bad guy. If you're muse female, you can be mother, lover, main character, victim. So the message with those are that the male muse characters have the widest variety of life choices. They can like do anything and they can change. And muse females only change from bad to good, and then they're often kind of sidekicks to the male character. So these are things that Lippy Green points out are problems. And then with the French accent, I'd like to point out that's one of those things where we think of it, maybe it's a positive stereotype, but a problem with a positive stereotype like that, or the positive stereotype of that Asians are good at math or something, is it's very limiting. So it makes their world very small. Why can't they be lawyers or doctors or adventurers? Why do they always have to be in these two things, food prep or flirting, right? And then with the Asian people are good at math stereotype, that discounts their accomplishments, right? So people study very hard to be good at math, right? It's not like you're born with some kind of gene that makes you good at math. And then it's also limiting because there's a lot of people who do a lot more things besides that, right? It's a limiting stereotype. So conclusions from Lippy Green is that male speakers of Standard American or British English have the widest variety of life choices open to them. They can be heroes, villains, humans, animals, attractive or unattractive. And for everybody else, including women, people with a Southern accent, AAVE speakers, non-English speakers, their world is much smaller. So Disney is not the only production company that does this, but it makes them so influential on children's culture because they have kind of a monopoly on it. The world's children watch these films, and they sort of hide behind the innocence of what the films are, and there are a lot of negative stereotypes in them that are promoted and taught to children. Also, Disney films are political because they follow patterns in our use of dialects and accents to think about who we are at war with or afraid of at the time. So she points out that during World War II, there are a lot of bad characters with Japanese and German accents. During the Cold War, they have Russian accents. During Iran-Iraq hostilities, there's Arabian characters. And then, are there any new patterns? What do you think? Think about that as you choose the film that you're going to watch. A lot of times in live action films, they'll use, I've noticed, North Korean characters as the bad guys because, first of all, they can't do much to fight back, except for we saw what happened with that one film. The Interview, is it? They did fight back on that one. But are there any other characters like China? What kind of characters do we see that are playing the bad guys? Okay. So, has anything changed? What I want you to do is go onto the discussion board, choose a film that was made after The Lion King. It can't be The Lion King or the Aladdin. It has to be a newer film. And then figure out if Disney has changed their ways because they know that people criticize them for doing this. Is there linguistic stereotyping? What kind of accents and characterization are used in the film? What are the themes and character development? Are there any political connections? You're going to talk about this and conclude your ideas about what the impact of these kind of films are on children, and then you're going to comment on other people's films as well. Okay, thank you.